Hey guys, how are you all beautiful people? Hope all of you are doing fine, and yeah, this is the next part of What If Naruto repeat the Chunin exams. When Naruto finds he is flung back in time and must repeat the entire Chunin exam over and over and over, until he gets it right and possibly saves Konoha in the bargain. So without any delay, let's start the video. Universal Translators, on. Jiraiya and Orochimaru faced each other across the flaming ruins of Konoha. Both proud men assumed attack stances, before Jiraiya declared, "The cheese is old and moldy." Orochimaru gave a long lick up the blade of his sword, "Into a pig head I must stick." The two of them glared at each other a moment before shaking themselves and declaring in unison, "Bad Japanese," and going off to kill the author. The scenery in Naruto's mind was an adequate reflection of his situation. When he'd first been there, it had resembled a sewer, dull and featureless and completely miserable, which had been a sad but telling representation of his life back then, underneath the cheerful facade. And who was Kakashi to talk about seeing underneath the underneath yet be unable to peer through even so flimsy a mask? Anyway, not long after he'd learned to use the resets to his advantage, things had begun to change in the landscape of his mind. Books had begun to appear in bookcases along the walls of the drier portions as he'd begun to read, and more of them as he'd learned to love it. The water drained out as his hopelessness retreated, and more features began to show up as he learned and gained new skills. There was a concert hall in there now, with plush seats and gold-plated art and everything. He had a woodworking shop with a vast array of tools out of his experience reworking his apartment. Still, it did not come close to being so extensive a workroom as existed for his more developed craft skills for working with cloth, metal and leather. A small jewelry counter with fine tools had appeared after he had done his wife's rings, and that promised to be expanded soon. The kitchen, once nice, now promised to be both expanded and upgraded also, as did the chemistry lab for mixing dyes, where a new section had been added that so far was just a bare floor with the scents and perfumes to be added here sign upon it. There was a small hospital within his mind, armed with a vast array of charts and some few medical devices, most of which did not work very well. But the anatomy models of 30 or so women lined the walls. Art, however, filled the place like a warehouse. Countless drawings and not a few paintings almost covered the walls. Artists' renditions, some crude and clumsy, others masterfully done, with everything in between, covered all of the available wall surfaces down there. And around them the halls had begun to morph until the place more closely resembled a fine mansion instead of a sewer. Windows had even begun to appear, showing forth green and cheerful forested hills beyond, representing future possibilities to come. It was, however, to the dojo where his steps now took him. That place had come into being to represent his ninja techniques and abilities. At first, it had resembled the sewer so closely one could not tell the difference between them, all dull and featureless and hopeless, even with a banner hung limply from one wall, labeled Shadow Clone. His one significant ninja achievement. Now the place was bigger, and countless throwing weapons hung from hooks upon the walls, ready to be taken down and used. To the one banner on the wall had been added many, one for every technique he'd mastered, and some of those banners were more fancy than others. As they had gone from "I barely know this" on up to mastery, they went from cheap and wrinkled grey-brown paper with dull black lettering and somewhat tatty, on up to some of his best examples, which were his basic 3 ninja techniques, that were expensive cloth of vivid scarlet with gold lettering, and exquisitely cared for. Body flicker was as impressive as they, and others were advancing. His sexy technique, along with his shapeshift power, made that an even 6 in gold and scarlet, but his mind's dojo was beginning to be festooned with festive blues and yellows representing less ridiculously perfected techniques. On one end also stood a trophy case. In there had been one award, previous to his entry into these resets, and that had been his initial fight with Zabuza. Now there were many other victories symbolized and remembered therein. Still, the dummy that stood in the corner, a statue of him, wore only a yellow belt, not very high up in Konoha's ranking scale at all, a symbol of his lack in martial arts compared to his other abilities. But that was okay, the place had come a long way in a short time and was due for more improvements yet. The boy rolled over in his sleep and continued resting. After the visit by the Hokage and the town dignitaries, there was no end of excited discussion in the upper circles of the village leaders, and this quickly spread down the ranks until even the lowest members had heard of the news. Naruto had threatened to turn the demon fox loose on them. It had already agreed to destroy his enemies. Countless people who had felt no fear at all bullying a small boy with no one to protect him wept like little children themselves over the recent threat to their own existence. On the other hand, news got out that the boy had a bloodline. Tenton's prediction came true more quickly than she would have imagined, as the clerk in the registry office dealing with the major clans and their abilities gave them the designation the Kitsune clan on their official registration of Konoha's members with advanced bloodlines. The man did it more than partly out of bitterness. Naruto would adopt it as his moniker of choice, wiping out the little fan signs that were all over his new house and property, to replace them with a fox head on a spiral background. The other clans were not amused. Naruto had, by then, completely dismantled the Uchiha properties one by one on previous resets, so he knew about all there was to know of their secrets. He'd found the secret purpose of the Sharingan beneath the clan shrine, and was not all that impressed by it. It was along the lines of spread misery, pain and death. Really, what would you expect of a bloodline whose highest powers could only be activated by killing your best friend? They'd created it. Seek a better yogurt recipe. They wouldn't have had to keep such a purpose secret. But he hadn't found the clan library, only proof that there was one. But even knowing it was there somewhere, he couldn't find it, which, having dismantled every building on the grounds, led him to be terribly impressed by the stealth under which they'd hidden it. There were, however, tucked in odd corners, forgotten behind bookshelves, fallen under beds, hidden inside of drawers and just part of the general mess, a few scrolls here or there that he'd discovered on techniques. About 30 or so, again, and not in any particular order or grouping. A substantial few of these were on the clan's martial art style, showing him more than Sasuke's scrolls had, although still very much incomplete. The style was clearly superior to the one taught in the academy, but what could you expect from a clan whose ability was to memorize anything they could see? By just keeping hold of the good bits even a dunce could establish something, and the ninja of the Uchiha clan had all had the academy training to start with, so it would have been simple to build up from there. However, there were enough blank spots, skipped portions and incomplete knowledge of it revealed in general on that scattered collection of scrolls that Naruto did not know how to learn it just yet, although he could get started practicing on what those scrolls did show. Most of the other scrolls covered ninja techniques that he already knew. The paralysis one, and body flicker were among them, also most of his fire stuff he found other copies of. But there were two new ones he'd never heard of before, as well as 4 illusions. One of the two was a wind technique that Naruto was quite glad for, as previously his only techniques for wind had been that sound amplifier he'd used as a microphone without speakers to carry his voice over wide areas, a gusty barricade for stopping thrown weapons, not that people used many of those on him, or at least they hadn't yet, and 2 attack forms, the big and clumsy slashing tornado he'd once used for cutting apart Manda, the giant snake, but was too unwieldy for most purposes, and a pressure bullet that shot out a ball of air for attacking over long distances. Those were nice, but it wasn't a wide selection. He'd had almost twice that number of earth and water techniques. Although the scrolls he got from Sajuke's apartment had numbered 30, and averaged 6 per element, it had been an average, not an exact distribution, and he'd been a little short on the wind and lightning departments, while being strong on earth and water, as far as numbers of techniques per element. This new one, breakthrough, was a welcome addition to an element he'd been previously short on, although it was more of that breathe it out through your mouth school of ninjutsu that it was difficult if not impossible to use wearing a full face helm with a breath mask attached. Actually, looking over that scroll, Naruto considered something. This looked, in most ways, very similar to something Orochimaru did when he wanted to destroy wide areas. They both released blasts of wind in a long cone to cause massive destruction, although the Snake Freak's version was clearly bigger and more powerful than this one was intended to be. They were probably related, though, like the Fireball and Great Fireball Jutsu, where one was just a bigger, more impressive version of the other. Tamarai would know. Actually, Naruto got a gleeful grin. Now wasn't exactly the time, but soon he could ask Tamarai all about her techniques. As a wind specialist, she had an impressive arsenal of one element he was currently short on. Yes, learning some of that could be very nice indeed. Hayashi was not a man used to dealing with equals. He'd had so few of them during his lifetime. The Uchiha clan head, back when there had been one, had not been an equal so much as a rival to be surpassed and overcome, although Hayashi knew in the minds of others the Hyugas were a distant second to the glory of the Uchiha. The other clans did not stand on equal footing with him, all being less than he was. Even his twin brother, having received a cursed seal on his forehead and not gotten the same quality of training, had not been an equal. Hayashi's life had been unequally divided between superiors and inferiors. Those who were inferior, which was most of them, had to be properly subservient or else risk being punished. While those who were superior, which was a small list mostly reserved for the Hokage and Uchiha clan head, could be worked around and circumvented if one wanted to badly enough. Acknowledging anyone as separate and equal chaffed and went contrary to his upbringing. Those who were strong ruled. It was the natural order of things and the reason he'd always been so harsh on his failure of a daughter. She was not strong, therefore she was not fit to rule. An accident of birth had made her clan heiress, but he had been working to fix that and replace her with her much more powerful younger sister, Hanabi. The town of Konoha was abuzz with news. There was a new bloodline-carrying clan in town. That was always good news and cause for celebration. What the bloodline was caused mixed feelings, to say the least. Particularly since the boy who carried it had always evoked strong negative reactions. To those who had no personal experience with the Kyuubi's attack, it was a cause for confusion over the rest of Konoha's reaction. But, not having been there, they could not understand, even if it got described to them, which it couldn't because of the Hokage's law against telling anyone. The mixed reaction was turning bad, however, and it didn't have far to go before it got very bad indeed. So, standing in his office, looking out over the village he had served for so many years, Sarutobi decided to do something that for many reasons he had felt was impossible for a great many years to come. Those reasons he had not shared it before now were good ones, very strong and compelling ones, absolutely crucial to the boy's safety. But if the village was going to react as strongly as they might against him, those previous reasons became meaningless. Yes, They had disliked Naruto Uzumaki before now, even been mildly cruel to him, and so many had been only mildly cruel that it had all added up to a very cruel life indeed for the boy, but no one single action was responsible. The Hokage had always believed that Naruto's actions could eventually win the town of his birth over. However, if they came to see his bloodline as the Kyuubi reborn in flesh, that would not happen. Some impressions, once they are made, are irreversible. And if they truly decided he was an enemy, they would make him into one, despite all of the boy's loyalty before this. Sarutobi sighed. If only the office of Hokage was actually as powerful as everyone seemed to think it was. He had a powerful hand in issuing orders, but the execution of those orders was always up to those who ought to obey them. Sometimes their own feelings overrode his wishes, and they twisted or ignored or neglected his orders to follow their own feelings. Even when that meant the social torture of a blameless boy, who also happened to be the only son of a hero they lovingly revered. Without Naruto's help the demon fox could not have been sealed, and it would have destroyed Konoha utterly and completely in its fury. Without a child to seal the demon into, the fourth Hokage would have been helpless to stop the creature's rampages. And, being the kind, brave and generous man that he was, the fourth had chosen to use his only son as the demon's containment vessel, believing that no other family should be made to sacrifice for his own plans, and asking only that his child be viewed as a hero for the sacrifice he was making. A wish that had been utterly, totally and completely ignored, when it was not actively stomped upon, spat upon, or worse, by the very village he had saved. No, the citizens of Konoha had never been rational when it came to the fox, and once they decided Naruto was the fox reborn, nothing would turn them from that, and they would either drive him out or kill him, or force him to release that demon upon them once again. They had always suspected him before, but with the new bloodline abilities registered it would go from a suspicion to fact in their minds. They would care nothing for his orders to protect or support the child then. They paid little enough attention to them now. No, Sarutobi decided. It would turn a portion of the village against him in either case, but it was time to reveal certain information before the rumors grew out of hand. He would tell them of his successor's sacrifice in greater detail than they had heard before, and who Naruto really was, and coach it all in terms of the fourth's victory over the Kyuubi, granting his line powers that he had stolen from the demon fox. It would mean that many of the fourth Hokage's very deadly enemies would seek the boy out and try to kill him, but better he be in danger from without than within, and Konoha was on the verge of driving that boy out forever. And that was if they didn't succeed in killing him. Or if he didn't actually release the demon upon them for trying. No, they had to be told, or else they'd destroy any possibility of keeping the fourth's legacy loyal to Konoha, if there was even a Konoha left after he was done with it. Sarutobi sent out Anbu to call the town together, close the shops and businesses to get everyone possible gathered together. He had a speech to give, and he'd give it to them exactly how he'd thought it out in his mind. He would reveal that Naruto was the only child of the fourth Hokage, and the reasons why that had to be concealed for so very long. He would tell them again that the boy was a hero, and if they failed to listen to him after that, then Konoha was ruined. Whether or not it survived, if they could reject him then, it was no longer the town that Sarutobi had cherished for most of his life. And he would tell them that, too. Because if they couldn't believe him then he was passing off this hat to whoever wanted it, to take his family and leave the village of his birth forever. And he would encourage Naruto and his new family to come with him. The shocked look on Naruto's face made the Hokage feel ill. As he'd made the announcement he'd expected some reaction, even prepared for many of those by preceding Anbu here or there to whisper the right thing at the right time for him. He had not prepared for how the look on Naruto's face stung him. It was as though he'd let the child starve, then told him there'd been a feast laid in the kitchen all along. The "why did you let me suffer like that" face of trust suddenly challenged by disbelief, that by retaining this information, he had actually helped to author some of the child's suffering. Sarutobi had never thought of it that way. He'd reasoned it all out before the child was a week old and never felt the need to challenge those assumptions since. It had been for the boy's own good. It had kept him safe. But he could see in Naruto's eyes the boy disagreed, that he had felt neither good nor safe. To the Hokage, the minor cruelties heaped upon the boy all of his life long were just that, minor. But he had never stopped to consider what it must have felt like to the boy at the center of them, when they made up his entire existence, and he did not have a whole lifetime of good experiences behind him to offset them and grant perspective. It was not a small portion of his life, as it had been for the Hokage. It had been the whole thing, and it wasn't coming at the end of a long life full of accomplishments, either. No, it had all taken place when the boy was growing and developing, going through the process of discovering who he was, when he was more vulnerable than at any other period of his life. A development that, Sarutobi realized at last, had been stunted by the cruel barbs he himself had dismissed as inconsequential. To Naruto, however, they'd been of great consequence. Sarutobi could see clearly in his face the boy would have far rather lived with the deadly peril, and been loved, than to have grown up as he did, safe yet hated. And in that perhaps he was correct, as the Uchiha also had many enemies, both in and out of Konoha, yet there had been few if any attempts on Sasuke's life. The town's opinions were thrown in turmoil again, now knowing that the child they had always hated was the only son of their most beloved hero, and just as much responsible for the sealing of the tailed beast as the dead hero they adored so. But the Hokage had underestimated just how much they'd hated the boy, and also how deeply rooted that had gotten, because not even this revelation made their opinions swing back to where he felt they ought to be, liking and respecting the boy at last. No, what they got was more turmoil. It made Sarutobi feel old. And he feared he might have to start planning that move. That situation was not resolved one way or another before the attack came on the day of the finals, as usual. Naruto thought they'd been ready. He'd planned, but things did not go the way he would have wished for them to. That day began with several thousand of his clones seeded out across the village, ready to spring out and counter enemy ninja, and that was the only reason he knew anything about that day at all. The real Naruto had been taken out in the first moments, before any warning had arrived. Orochimaru, knowing that Gaara, after having befriended Naruto, was not liable to help him destroy the village, had had a whole month to go seek other options, and knowing Gaara was liable to join in the defense of Konoha, he'd brought not one extra sidekick along, but several. It started when they were all waiting for Sasuke, as usual. Many of Naruto's sprites had lost their fights and that had much of his attention captured, but then the walls inside the waiting area had exploded and he knew no more. His clones, seeded around that area as well as other battle sites, had seen enough to piece together what happened later. Some freaky bone guy with a sound headband had broken into the waiting room where contestants stayed between their fights, and he'd taken down Naruto so fast it wasn't even funny, departing with a shot back to the other genin, something about how his master wanted the blonde brat for his parties and so he was going to get the blonde brat for his parties. Bullets and javelins of bone had slaughtered some of the other hopefuls, but they were still trying to muster a group to follow after the ninja in his escape when a woman in her early 20s just walked right out of the wall, grabbed Hinata around the throat, and phased back out through the stone. The trouble was, that woman was wearing a headband from the hidden village of Cloud, not Sund or Sound. After that it would have been reasonable to assume that a large party of Cloud Ninja would join with the attackers from the other two villages, but aside from that one woman, whom he'd say was a Chunin, none of his clones had reported seeing any other Cloud headbands among the invasion army. Nor were those the only shocks. There were several others. Hinata was gone before anyone realized that the bone-using guy had slapped Gaara with a forced sleep illusion, putting Gaara under and allowing the personality of the one-tailed demon raccoon to take over. That had been a mess, to say the least, as no one had even realized what was wrong before the monster was already forming out of sand, and they'd been forced to flee, fight or die. Although, for those genin, fighting and dying were almost the same thing against Gaara's demonic body. The extent of this catastrophe had been small enough to escape notice from the stands, so the audience was largely unaware of them until they'd all gone beyond easy fixing, and by then they'd had their own problems. Naruto had been through this battle enough times to know that a big cause for the massive casualties had been someone putting the entire stadium to sleep, where they could be killed like sitting ducks. So, not knowing who or how, Naruto had seeded that area and its environs with clones to spy out whoever did it and how it was done. He'd spotted an Anbu in the back of the crowd's pull off the technique. This time through he'd placed his clones so they were able to catch him, however. It was Kabuto. They'd only fought for a few moments before he'd lost his mask, and it was the ninja who'd always been so friendly during the early steps of the exam, standing there wearing a sound headband. The shock was enough that his clones stopped fighting and Kabuto destroyed all of the ones around him, before making good on his escape. That had only been the beginnings of this catastrophe, however. Apparently deciding that he could not count on Gaara not to be woken before he went all demony on everyone, Orochimaru had brought in more. From different parts of the village lightning gathered together to form the six-tailed demon tiger, and various other elements combined to form the eight-tailed demon dragon. The Konoha left behind by these three terrible beasts was not even fit to call a crater, having been blasted so many times it was more of a dip in the ground without even so much as a recognizable burn or impact shape. The shinobi from Sand and Sound had to do nothing more than prevent Konoha ninja from escaping. One last clone survived that destruction, having followed after the bone guy in the shape-shifted form of a normal red fox, catching up to him after the other pursuing clones had been destroyed, and when the guy apparently thought he was free and clear. Or perhaps it was that he'd been paying more attention to the two guys in black towels who'd stopped him, the overstuffed bathrobe sort of look that made you doubt the guy in it was wearing any underpants, or pants. That clone had survived long enough to hear the name, Itachi, before one of the towel guys noticed their eavesdropper and pierced him with a senbon, or something. In truth the clone didn't even know what hit it. Orochimaru was amused, not just a little amused but very, as virtually all of his long-term plans had come to fruition in one day and it was now setting on towards night. Really, how could it get any better than this? By promising to restore Tsunade boyfriend and brother to life, he'd gotten her to heal Kimimaro Kaguya, who was among his most useful servants. With his assistance and power, it had been child's play to arrange a number of other helpful incidents and additions to his plans. Orochimaru, having been in the criminal organization Akatsuki, who sought the tailed demons to use their power, had a fair idea of where some of them were, so went and got them. And he'd used two demons because he was certain one would be opposing him. Simple battle by numbers meant always making sure they're on your side, or at least not against it. As far as sealing or unsealing those beasts went, he didn't bother. The great 5 ninja villages had each tried creating their own, but many of the minor villages had experimented with that as well, hoping that by doing so they could become major villages. However, due to the many drawbacks of the results, not many had kept those vessels around. He already knew of at least 3, possibly 4, demon vessels who were outcast, abandoned by their villages, simply ripe for the taking. Since Akatsuki was not going to be active on the demon capturing phase of their plan for many years yet, that meant they were still wandering around unclaimed. So Orochimaru claimed them. When his first idea to use a vessel didn't work, he merely went out and got others, then modified their seals to have the same weaknesses as Gaara's. Child's play, really. He wondered why he hadn't gone and done it before. Oh, yes. The Kazekage of Sand had caught wind of some of his plans and was about to warn Konoha, so he'd had to kill him. Then, having done it, it had seemed so artful to turn one ally against the other. So instead of facing 2 villages allied against him, through one assassination and impersonation he could turn one against the other to aid in his own plans. It had been artful, really. But not as satisfying as what he'd just accomplished. That blonde boy had forced him to modify his plans until really the end result had been better than his plans before it. He really ought to thank that child for inspiring him to new heights when it came to his plan to destroy Konoha, as the end result had been a thing of art, truly a form of poetry in destruction. Not only had he destroyed his former teacher and the village that had once rejected his rights to do with their citizens as he pleased, but he'd tweaked the nose of his former criminal comrades while doing it. One of the problems with the Akatsuki organization was they had to do things in a certain order. He was not so bound. They had to steal and seal all of the tailed beasts in order from least to greatest, and so they wouldn't dare to move before they had found them all, lest they tip off others to their plans and create resistance. An enemy, knowing they needed those demons for their plots, might destroy one of the containers, slaying the beast inside, just to frustrate them, as Akatsuki needed all of those beasts in order to carry out their grand plan. So, they could not act until they were fully prepared to move quickly and decisively, carrying out their plan completely before anyone could react to try and stalemate them. Thus, until they were fully prepared to collect them all, with everything ready to do so, they dare not capture any. It was one of the many reasons he'd left the organization. They had no flexibility or imagination. And they couldn't begin the demon capturing stage of their plan at once anyway, as they had other stages they intended to go through first, namely accumulating the wealth required to construct a mercenary army, and then constructing it, before they even began to hunt for demon containers. So he'd gone and borrowed a couple of those demon containers they'd found out about, but hadn't yet made any moves against. If they'd died during that battle, that was nothing to him, except that it would amuse him to no end to see the Akatsuki frustrated like that. They had such small minds, really. He'd gone and achieved 2 of their goals without them, creating his own hidden village, more loyal and cheaper than an army of mercenaries, and thus a more than an adequate substitute, and by doing so already got wealthy. He could achieve the power they desired simply by destroying the other ninja villages, one by one, in strikes like this one, and the irony was many of the survivors would come flocking to him as missing ninja. It would amuse him to frustrate more of Akatsuki's plans in the future, but for now taking their precious demon containers under his wing and sending them out in active combat where they might die amused him enough. Of course, playing in their sandbox, this blatantly guaranteed his former criminal friends would come after him in return, which ordinarily he would not have risked, as it would have cost him too much time away from his other projects dealing with them. But with Kimimaro fully healed by Tsunade, well, he had less cause to fear those visits. Significantly less cause. Akatsuki, who had agents watching those demon vessels, had caught him going to interact with their prey, so followed along to see what he was doing. But Atakai and his partner had run away rather than face him and Kimimaro together, when he'd caught them interrupting his agent's escape with that lovely blonde-haired party thrower. Cloud had also sensed something, as he'd spotted an agent or two of theirs about. They'd most likely been tipped off something was up when he'd begun gathering demon containers to his service, just like Akatsuki had. But they had not interfered with his plans, most likely just there to see if they could gain any advantage out of the destruction of their old enemy. No, life really didn't get any better than this. Orochimaru was ignorant of it as the reset occurred, shifting things back to their starting point and erasing all of the Snake Sanin's hard-won progress and satisfaction, putting him back near the beginning of his plans. Naruto didn't know about anyone else, but after a month-long honeymoon that ended with his brides, friends, village, and everybody else he knew or even cared about being abducted and or killed, he thought he was going to need a day or two to recuperate before heading off to do the whole month all over again. Still, some questions were just going to bug him until he got answers for them, so he might as well start out early, so long as he pursued it in a low-stress kind of way. He'd long ago been able to create an info card without any of the items or persons he was seeking present, just using images pulled out of his mind, and he'd developed an exceptional memory. So, that morning, on his way to the written part of the Chunin test, he made one for that Cloud Ninja chick, patterned after the ones the spy used, and when Kabuto came over to talk to them he, after restraining the urge to strangle the traitor, bent over to pick up a dropped card and showed it to Kabuto, asking him, "Who is this?" Seeing as how he was part of that invasion, he might just know. Kabuto accepted the card from him in some surprise. "Well, I didn't even know I had a card on this lady. In fact, I'm sure I didn't. Where did you get this?" Naruto just gave him a childish and helpless, "I don't know" sort of shrug and gestured to where he'd bent over toward the floor. "Who is it?" Ino asked. "Bless her heart." Kabuto straightened up his glasses and looked more closely at the card. It was disturbingly like his own, even patterned with the same back. He could have sworn he hadn't been foolish enough to carry any of these kind of cards to the Chunin test, where he wouldn't need them. And he really didn't think he had, as this one was missing most of the data he had on his card for her. Seeing the eyes of the genin on him, Kabuto had to be mindful of his disguise of a friendly, helpful, older student and smiled. "Well, this belongs more in a bingo book than a card collection like mine. This lady is Ujitonii, her rank is probably Jonin. She's a cloud ninja who has sometimes been called the living ghost. Rumor has it she can walk through walls, breathe fire, and a host of other things. Luckily we won't be having to deal with anyone like her on this test, or I'd flunk my 7th time for sure." And with that, the special infiltration agent put the card away, giving it a place among his own until he could analyze it to learn where it came from. He wouldn't pay very much attention to the stray dogs fighting over garbage that would witness where he was going as he left for that day, nor the fox hiding under some bushes by a rabbit hole on the next, or the rabbit chewing on grass further along on his path the day after that. No, he wouldn't notice those at all. But they would notice him, and note where he was going. Yes, they would note that very carefully indeed. Kabuto had just become a man to watch. Listening in on Kabuto's conversation with Orochimaru as the two traitors talked was enlightening. Very enlightening indeed. Naruto had known the ears were useful, as they'd proved that by themselves more or less right out of the box. On Tenten's advice he'd begun to test out the tail, and to his surprise it looked very much like that was going to be an effective tool in his arsenal from then on. While he could not yet use any of his techniques with it, indications were pretty clear he soon would, as he was almost there with some of them already. That left him to consider the last of his foxy accessories, the oft-forgotten whiskers. When they'd been nothing more than lines on his face, that's all they'd been, lines on his face. He might have put them there with makeup for all of the difference they made. Now that they stuck out like hairs, though, things were entirely different. Much like he'd worked hard at ignoring the sensations caused by his tail, the boy had actively shut out what he'd been feeling out of those whisker hairs. But now that he was paying attention to them, he realized they were yet another information-gathering device. He could sense breezes no one else would notice. That was the first one, but far from the last. His ability to sense air movements through them was so acute that he could tell when bodies around him were in motion, whether or not he could hear or see them. As he began to explore this, he discovered that ability could be used as a sort of danger sense. Objects in motion around him could be sensed as they shifted the air. Fast movements made pressure waves completely different than slow ones did, and after some practice he began to be able to tell, just by feeling with his whiskers, what was moving and where. So, when something began to come at him quickly, the pressure waves it created still got there first, regardless of how fast it was, and by being able to detect those pressure waves, he could often react to something before it arrived. Even the air displaced by ninja techniques like body switch or flicker made distinctive impressions that he began to learn how to detect and react to before the ninja had fully arrived. Potentially deadly useful as a ninja technique, although like all of the rest his ability to use it properly would have to be developed. Another thing the medics had proclaimed him as having was excellent night vision. Naruto had never given it any thought. How he saw at night was simply how he saw at night. It had never occurred to him to wonder if that was better or worse than anyone else's. But Tenten had gone all squealy over how useful that was to Ninja, and how much it would benefit her progeny, and how well suited it was especially in combination with their fantastic ears, making them even better scouts. It had hurt a surprising amount to lose her. Even though he could get her back, he wasn't eager to do it only to lose her again. That hurt. Naruto had been busy adapting the Inuzuka clan flash suppressor technique from their nose to his ears, since when they became a clan that became a known issue, there would be ninja out there intending to take advantage of his keen hearing to use that against him. Although one thing he had not expected was how much more easily he could find his girls during their month of wedded bliss after that first morning. At first he couldn't understand it, he just knew where they were without looking, just knowing. He was beginning to think he had some kind of psychic mate sense or whatever you want to call it, until Gaara stroked his tail, looking alert like a toddler that had just discovered stuffed animals. And all of a sudden he could find him, too. And now, after the reset, he couldn't find any of them. After some study in the library on the subject of foxes, he was able to find out why. It was his tail. He had a scent gland in the tip, and whatever touched that he could find so easily he wasn't even aware how he'd been doing it. So he had an ability to mark stuff if he wanted to find them later. That could be useful. Hey Sasuke. The blonde genin walked up to his teammate and slapped him on the back, before whispering in his ear loud enough for all to hear, I was just wondering, why does your hair look like a duck's butt? The last Uchiha growled and threw a fist at him. Naruto, who'd read about that move now, not only blocked it but spun the other boy about until he had him pinned on the floor underneath him. The orange-clad genin peered more closely into his teammate's hair, before jumping back and declaring, I knew it. You are a natural pink head. You just dye it. Ooh. The blonde boy squirmed in disgust. That means Sakura is only after you to fill all of her sick, incestuous fantasies. The room full of Chunin hopefuls broke out laughing. Sakura was mortified. Sasuke was disgusted by his teammate acting like this, and, as he picked himself up off of the floor, opted to ignore him. Naruto was grinning both outside and in. He'd been using a simple disguise technique instead of his full shapeshift to hide his foxy bits, and, now having slapped the guy with his tail as well as his hand to disguise that contact, he could experiment with how far a range he could detect someone over, and how long a scent marking lasted, gathering useful information on the limits of his new ability, while practicing with all of the rest of them, too. As he watched his teammate sulk, and pretend not to have been humiliated before the other Chunin hopefuls waiting to take the written test, Naruto began recalling to mind something that the Hokage had told him a few times he'd been in there to get the Uchiha property. Sasuke had been subjected to torture by his brother for several days using a special illusion. The special part of that to Naruto was the illusion. He'd asked about this in more detail the few times he'd dared, and all the Hokage would say was that it was a special, secret technique that trapped a victim inside their mind for 3 days while the one who cast it tortured them. Well, Naruto had no interest in torturing anyone. Well, except maybe Sasuke, but the broody brat deserved it. On that point, at least, he could agree with Itachi. But anyway, the real value of this, to him, lay in that special illusion. What if you didn't want to torture anyone? What if you just wanted to spend time with them? And, if you really could capture someone in an illusion that lasts only a second or so, but you get 3 days with them, he could be training them. There were tons of things he'd like to teach Tenten and Hinata before they began the second stage of the Chunin exam. Obviously, he didn't have the time during real time. But if he could be training them up on some of those abilities, they'd have much easier tests not only during the prelims, but during the finals, too. This idea kicked learning new illusions up a notch on his personal priority list. And the best teacher for that was Kuinai. After a failed appeal to his teacher of choice, Naruto had shapeshifted into a pile of paperwork and had one of his shadow clones, shapeshifted into the form of one of the Hokage's clerks, carry him into the office to set him on the Hokage's desk before Kuinai got there, as he'd wanted to know why she went to the Hokage's office after refusing to train him. And Hinata's teacher entered with a full head of steam, getting right to the point the moment she arrived. "Hokage, you've got to let me teach him. Naruto's basic clone is picture perfect, you could shave by it. He uses no hand seals to call it forth and it arrives without hardly a trace, even a skilled ninja could easily miss its arrival if they weren't careful. His transformation is almost as good, and his veil isn't the usual one, it has fewer limits of size and space and a much greater operator range. The kid is a natural illusion genius. I can't think of how he got so good with all of the lousy teaching he's had. Plus, I've seen him using nin info cards that other Genin Kabuto is flashing around, the ones based on our secret markers. But Naruto makes his own. Those are another form of C-rank illusion, one programmed and imprinted on a solid object to be activated by chakra. We have Chunin who call themselves illusion specialists who don't have Naruto's facility for this art. Sarutobi was nodding, sucking on his pipe with a big smile. I'm glad to hear it. But, as you know, that decision ultimately resides with Kakashi, as his Jonin instructor, and so far he's refused, saying it will disrupt his own plans for Naruto's development. Kuinai leaned over, placing her hands on the Hokage's desk. Kakashi has no plans for Naruto's development. He plans to keep him back so he can treat his favorite to the ability to taunt his rival for being useless. The Hokage instantly went from kind old man to a stern taskmaster. That is enough. Kuinai, when I trusted Kakashi to be Naruto's Chunin instructor, it was with the utmost faith in his ability. And I do not suspect his having entered Naruto into the Chunin exams, over his academy instructor's protests, was an attempt to hold him back. Hinata's teacher stood back, humbly. One did not argue with the Hokage lightly, and she'd overstepped some bounds. I'm sorry for my presumption. Good day, Hokage-sama. She bowed her head and turned to leave. Well, Naruto had gotten an earful of interesting information. With a deliberate bamf, Naruto was suddenly sitting on the Hokage's desk in his usual form. Actually, I've also got a variant of the transformation that, according to Abisu, ought to be an S-ranked technique. It's an actual, physical change instead of an illusion. The Hokage, his two Anbu guards, and Kuinai all stood staring at him slack-jawed. He might have to do this again. Reaching over, he tweaked the Hokage's nose. And Gramps, if you think Kakashi cares about anyone but the Uchiha, you're sorely mistaken. If he could have left me out of the exams and still entered his prodigy, he would have. He's never given me any training of any kind. I've had to work on my own for everything I've learned. So whatever schedule he says you might be interrupting is hogwash. Sarutobi was sputtering. Naruto. Enough. As your instructor, Kakashi has my full faith and trust. The boy leaned over and stared at the old man nose to nose. Gramps, if you trust him, then I can no longer trust you. Which will it be? The scene was silent for several moments, before Sarutobi sighed. Has he really been that cruel to you, Naruto? In a word. Yes. The boy stood there, proudly folding his arms. I'd have done better on any other team. If his words had been a whip lashing him, Sarutobi would hardly have acted any differently. But Naruto, if things are that bad, why didn't you say anything? Naruto went nose to nose with the Hokage and told him flatly, he's had your full faith and trust. I told you, old man, and you didn't believe me. I was in here complaining and you dismissed me. I had to wait until there was another Jonin saying the exact same thing and then show you skills you hadn't known I'd learned, because Kakashi cares nothing for my instruction and so didn't bother to report to you because he'd never seen it, before you'd believe me. That answer seemed to deflate the Hokage, filling him up with sadness. He was a student of your father's. I had hoped. The old man gave it up and sighed. I'm sorry, Naruto. Truly sorry indeed. Sorry doesn't get me any training, the demon container interrupted. I've had to lie, cheat, and steal to get my ninja abilities. And while it's done wonders for my stealth skills, I shouldn't have had to treat my instructor as an enemy combatant out to restrict my growth by any means possible. Yes, of course. Kuinai, you may teach him what you will. The old man waved a gnarled old hand tiredly, seeming very frail in that moment. Naruto, the old man's voice came to them as Hinata's teacher was opening the door for them both. It should not need to be said, but just so you know for certain, you have heard it from my own mouth, Kakashi is no longer the instructor of Team 7. His status as an instructor of any sort will be put on probation, pending a full investigation of his actions. Deliberately sabotaging one's own students' welfare is an inexcusable charge, and he will pay the penalty, I assure you. Naruto nodded firmly and left with Kuinai. After the demon container and his new teacher were gone, Sarutobi mustered enough of himself to chuckle dryly to his guards. And now I shall never again be able to entirely free myself of the suspicion that my paperwork is spying on me. Kuinai was a dream teacher in many ways. She knew exactly how to coach what she was saying in terms her students could understand. She was also fair. Since Naruto would be learning illusions under her, she called her whole team together to let them sit in on those lessons, so no one was left out. Illusions being her peculiar area of specialty, she knew a lot to pass on, too. For Naruto this was bliss, as she knew a great deal of why things worked with illusions and was able to pass that on to him in ways that demystified the whole art for him, not enough to free him up to experiment, as it was all the hows and whys of how to use them properly, because she didn't feel ready yet to tell them the nuts and bolts of how they really worked, but it did help him substantially in perfecting and tweaking all of the illusions he knew. She would have gone faster, but was keeping it to a pace at which her team could follow, although the Chunin positively glowed when he caught on at once and started to ask insightful questions. Hey, you study about an art for years, even if only peripherally, and you learn what to ask when you start learning the topic itself. And Naruto had always had an amazing gift at learning. That was when he was actually being taught something, rather than put off, ignored or sabotaged. No, he was making Kuinai a very happy teacher indeed. Of course, that was not all that was going on. Naruto had a team of clones strip mining the Uchiha estate, blasting the topsoil off to expose the bedrock underneath, looking for signs of concealed construction even on that. Hey, that Uchiha library had to be somewhere, right? And if it wasn't in a building it was probably buried. Somehow he doubted they'd be trusting enough to place it on someone else's property. He also had clones out mastering the wind techniques Tamrai had shown him, as well as others practicing everything else he still had on the development list, like all of his chakra control exercises and perfecting the last little touches on his basic techniques, while practicing his other skills. Among those other techniques were a whole new slew of chakra control exercises he'd devised through Tenten's suggestion about using his tail in battle, because if he could channel chakra through his tail to create jutsu, why not explore using it through other areas of his body? He'd fought Neji more than once in the Chunin finals, and he'd listened to that heavenly spin technique of his described more than once. It required the boy to emit chakra from all over his body as one of the steps to executing it. So, that was something Naruto began to try. He might or might not be able to use the actual technique, probably not, as everyone kept saying it needed the Hyuga bloodline to use properly, and Kakashi not having copied it seemed to bear that out. But still, every other time he'd learned to manipulate his chakra in new ways, one of the payoffs from that had been more control. Nor was he sticking to just that. The very idea of using chakra through other places on your body threw off all sorts of limits on his progress. He'd been taught to float a leaf above his forehead. Now he had clones out there practicing that, with the leaves floating above his hands, shoulders, feet, elbows, nose, tongue, ears, armpits, back, whiskers, tail and so on. The same thing with the tree climbing thing. Instead of sticking to a vertical surface using his feet alone, he was now trying to use other areas of his body, so he could sit on the side of a wall, cling to it with the backs of his arms, palms, knees, tail, the top of his head and so on. Any part of his body was fair game for this, and by branching out like this he was learning lots and accelerating the pace of his improvement. Already his chakra control was back to where Abisu would have called it, tolerable, above average, but barely, which, of course, was making it easier to learn illusions. And, what was better yet, he still hadn't topped out on what this new type of exercise could teach him. He was still expanding his control from there. Experimenting with those seals was still consuming an awful lot of clones. Actually, one happy incident about the whole seal experiment thing was that his limiters had improved to the point where he could, between them and his newly improved base of chakra control, pass himself off as having perfect control, if only barely, and only when he was concentrating real hard on it. But that still opened up whole new avenues to pursue on his medical studies. Now he could pretend to be one of those rare people with perfect control, so could qualify for the really intensive and valuable classes, learning the highest grades of medical skills that were also the most valuable. And, over the past few resets since the wedding and before getting Chunin as a teacher, he'd been doing exactly that, getting his clones to take over for him during not only the written but the forest tests so he could use that time himself, spending it at the hospital getting his medical skills up. And they had been shooting up nicely, too. After only one day under Chunin already, Naruto was looking forward to more of the same from her. He was just walking along toward home for more training, having had clones deliver meals out to where Chunin was teaching them to maximize that opportunity so she wouldn't call it for meals, yet still having exhausted what she was willing to teach for the day, when he caught Sakura coming up to him in a fine head of steam. "Naruto, where have you been? Kakashi called us together, but you didn't show up. I've been out looking for you for hours. You shouldn't waste a lady's time like that." He batted away her hand where she tried to grab him to haul along behind her like a disobedient child. "Hirano, there is a code of conduct a girl has to live up to before she can be called a lady. You don't, therefore, you aren't." Her anger quickly turned to shock, then confusion. Since when he had ever stood up to her, or talked back to her, before? Hey! That was insulting. Since when was she not a lady? She ought to smack him for, then her mind kicked in and analyzed that statement. Her mom had said much on the topic of ladylike behavior, and she hadn't been. How'd Naruto known she hadn't been living up to that? Who'd told him about that code anyway? Where had he heard of it? Sakura's mind grasped for any excuse it could to avoid coming to face that he was right on the button about her behavior, that it was as far from ladylike as it was possible to get and not be a gorilla. There were other ways of breaking that code, it was true, other extreme paths she might have followed. But between her shouting and rudeness to him in general, not to mention her violence, those parts she was breaking almost as thoroughly as one can. The girl filled with shame and cringed back, an oops, caught expression on her face. Still, the crisis got taken out of her hands as Kakashi showed up. "Naruto, you did not arrive when I called the team together. That's because you don't have any authority to call our team together. You aren't on it. You are no longer our instructor anymore. I heard it from the Hokage's own mouth, you don't teach anyone anymore. You are on probation for having majorly screwed up with us." Kakashi looked on him, what parts of his face could be seen filled with both sadness and disappointment. "So, it was you. Who turned you in?" "Yeah. It was me." "What of it?" Naruto sent a challenge right back. "What was it you've always said, those who abandon their team are worse than garbage? Well, that's what you are. You could only hope that someday you might rise as high as only being garbage." Sakura flinched back from this exchange. "Say, why were you ever given a team, anyway?" Naruto asked his teacher. "I am the perfect teacher for Sasuke," Kakashi stated boldly. "Really?" Naruto leaned in close to stare in the Jonin's exposed eye. "Here I thought you had 3 students." Turning away to walk home, Naruto noticed they had drawn something of a crowd. Kuinai had taught her lessons at one of the training grounds, and it had just been easier to cross the academy from where he'd been on his route to where he was going. Since classes had just gotten out, there were dozens of ninja listening to this exchange. So he turned right back to face Kakashi. "Oh, by the way, the Hokage let slip this morning that you were a student of my father's." Kakashi's eye went wide, in a slightly panicked way. "Now I may not have known who my father was," Naruto lied expertly. "That secret was always kept from me. But it was real easy to look up who your one and only teacher was, the fourth Hokage." Gasps were heard from the assembled ninja. Sakura's jaw dropped wide open. Naruto stood there boldly, placing his hands on his hips to declare, "From that start it was easy to confirm, I am the son of the fourth Hokage." He shouted out in a loud voice that covered the entire schoolyard, whereupon hundreds more came by to listen, shock and disbelief in many of their eyes. "But you sacrificed me, sabotaging my progress, letting no other teacher train me while you deliberately held me back," he told Kakashi at the top of his lungs. "And you didn't even do it to make your own favorite student better. That much could have been served by making us both compete for abilities. No. Instead you chose to do it just to stroke his already bloated, ugly pride. You did it to make him feel superior." Kakashi's eye was now widened into an "oops, caught" expression. Naruto crowded into the Jonin's personal space, yet continued shouting. "Now I don't know what punishment a teacher gets for betraying his students. But this much I will tell you, whatever bonds of honor, love or loyalty you owe my family, you have broken. Whatever debts you owed to your teacher you have failed to repay, and not just failed, but utterly turned your back upon. You have spat upon honor. You have turned aside from duty. You have shat upon trust. And whatever oaths you owed to my father, the fourth Hokage, you have betrayed." Turning his back upon the Jonin, Naruto called back over his shoulder. "Your own father was called on to commit suicide over a dishonor less than yours. But you haven't even got the sense to feel shame over it. Kakashi, by your behavior you define worthless. All of Konoha is soiled by having you a member of it." Sakura practically fainted over this storm of fury directed to her teacher. And with that, Naruto stormed out of the courtyard, leaving the assembled ninja stunned, stumped and flabbergasted to start rumors behind him. For once, they would even be in his favor. "Is it true, Sarutobi? Is the demon child the son of the fourth?" a council member seriously asked while that body was in session, only waiting for him to deny it so they could go drop severe punishment on the boy for claiming it. Sarutobi could sense that, and was inwardly cursing his loose mouth. Naruto truly was a genius ninja, both to have penetrated his office and to have made so much out of a careless slip of his tongue. Also, he'd grown up an orphan, so it was hardly surprising that he'd brag about his family the moment he knew of it. "Yes, it is true," he sighed, taking out his pipe and blowing a plume of smoke before continuing. Arashi decided to use his own son as the vessel, viewing it as his family's responsibility to contain the beast and save Konoha. It was his last request that his son be treated as a hero. A request which this council has consistently ignored. When they weren't actively betraying it, he finished off pointedly, causing the assembled clan heads to stir uncomfortably in their seats. "We didn't know," one of them blurted out defensively. "You knew enough," Sarutobi retorted, striking while the iron was hot. "Even if you cared nothing for the fourth Hokage or his wishes, there is still the fact that all of you here know enough about seals to know that demon could not have been contained without a child to seal it into. Naruto is just as much responsible for saving us all from the nine-tailed fox as his father. There was much uncomfortable stirring and glancing about among the members of that august body. Sarutobi blew out another cloud of smoke. Naruto's ancestry could not have been revealed without a danger to his life. Arashi made far too many enemies at home and abroad during his exploits that made him qualify for the office. It was my intention not to reveal his parentage until the boy was a Jonin, able to protect himself in his own right from the enemies he would inherit, and I'd hoped by that point he'd also have a loyal team to stand by him, neither of which is the case now. The boy is outcast even among his own teammates. He gave them a pointed glare, while they did their best to avoid meeting his gaze. Most of them had at one point or another subtly worked to encourage people to ostracize the boy, and those who hadn't done it themselves knew that it was going on, could have worked to stop it, and hadn't. Those of them who had been ninja, which was by far the majority, began to consider, for the first time in their lives, what it would be like to have a team that hated you, and most could not imagine it. Their teams had made up their closest and most precious friends over most of their lives. They started to squirm as they realized that was just a bit of the damage they'd done, both to the boy and the memory of possibly the most cherished hero of Konoha. One of those, who owned a chain of shops and had always nurtured a secret pride over how much money he'd managed to chisel out of the boy, began to feel that high percentage of the orphan's allowance he'd effectively stolen, and always felt a trophy of his own personal victory over the Kyuubi, turn to ash and lead in his mind. He'd always before cherished the pain and poverty he'd caused Naruto, and now began to feel decidedly ill inside, as he'd once counted himself a friend of Arashi Kazuma and had taken that revenge out on the child in his old friend's name. Then he began to consider the special kunai he'd commissioned to sell to the child, the worst it was possible to make that still looked normal. That man was not alone among them in having his face turn white in shame. There were many others among them who'd done the same type of deeds in their own particular ways. True remorse of conscience began to appear in that room. Sarutobi sighed, feeling tired, saddened that it had taken this to change their minds concerning Arashi's child. It was my intent not to tell Naruto until he was far more prepared to protect himself. But in a careless slip of the tongue, I told him enough today that he was able to figure out the rest. His skills are remarkable, despite his lack of training, and others who've acted deliberately to hold him back. He gave several council members, particularly those with influence over the Ninja Academy, pointed looks of disapproval. They all squirmed beneath that glare. The Hokage leaned back in his chair, replacing his pipe and sucking on it. I will, of course, be releasing Arashi's house and scrolls to the boy. Now that he has the dangers, he may as well enjoy the benefits. There came a complete lack of disagreement from others in that chamber. The results of this news being confessed by guilty, shamefaced, remorseful clan heads in private to their own respective clans was far different to having the Hokage declare it to an angry and confused town. The remorse felt by their own clan heads transmitted down to those who had obeyed their orders to mistreat the boy or shun him. They felt their own guilt and shame over their treatment of him, and the encouragement they gave to others to do so. And it all made them so unhappy that they resolved to treat him better, and the tests went swimmingly. Then they made him Chunin and the resets ended and they all lived happily ever after until Akatsuki conquered the world and made them all into slaves. The results of this news being confessed by guilty, shamefaced, remorseful clan heads in private to their own respective clans was far different to having the Hokage declare it to an angry and confused town. The remorse felt by their own clan heads transmitted down to those who had obeyed their orders to mistreat the boy or shun him. They felt their own guilt and shame over their treatment of him, and the encouragement they gave to others to do so. It was hard to reverse the habits of a lifetime, but slowly, as those people realized what they'd done, they began to realize just to what extent they'd hurt someone who was entirely innocent of hurting them, and the remorse began to kick in. The first time Naruto got a shy smile from an average citizen, it scared him to death. Nothing like that had ever happened before, and he didn't know how to deal with it. It seemed far more likely to be the bait for some form of trap, and he instantly went on guard and began looking around for where the trouble was going to come from. After shouting, "I never did anything to you," as a way of covering himself from future blame, Naruto ran off, slightly panicked. It made that citizen sick inside, and the many other villagers who had been watching were stunned. Had they really been so bad? Virtually all of them had heard the news of the boy's parentage by then. Most of them were unsure how they felt about it. But seeing the boy's instant defensive reaction to a simple smile was disheartening to say the least. Hadn't anyone ever smiled to the boy before? Surely someone had. Then one little girl innocently asked, "Who?" And they were all stumped. Every one of them imagined someone else had done it at some point, but when it came right down to admitting it, none could say they'd done it, and that began to trigger a very depressing reaction, as they realized, most of them for the first time, just what a very hostile life the son of their hero had lived. And that every one of them were partly responsible for the environment he'd grown up in, where a simple smile was so out of place as to trigger an instant fear reaction. Their shame of having done that to him began to build. Naruto would have cared more about this if he'd known more of what was going on. As it was, he did what he'd grown used to doing every day, and trained hard to be a better ninja. It had been said before but really ought to be repeated. The child had no friends and no life, no hobbies, and, if it had been possible for him to learn nothing but ninja skills, he would have. All of those crafts and trades he'd picked up had been results of sheer boredom or some other pressing need. As for friends, he had people he liked, that he even considered friends, but at the start of each repeat they'd be back to treating him the way they had before. There was no one there to really understand him, no one to relate to him, and none to just hang out with on a regular basis without tedium setting in when they couldn't, change their reactions. Really, without something to stabilize himself, the boy was approaching burnout. He'd been under a great deal of strain through most of his life, and the resets hadn't materially improved his social standing. Even now, with most of the village beginning to feel sorrowful over their treatment of him, it did little more than wig him out. He wasn't used to dealing with it. Didn't know how to deal with it, to be honest. So, he avoided them to bury himself in his training. The Hokage noticed this, scrying on the boy through his crystal ball, and felt sorrow. He hadn't believed that they'd gotten to the boy to damage him so severely. But it was apparent now that they had. He'd only just missed it. But it was night, and very late at that. Since the second stage of the Chunin exams began tomorrow, he'd have to wait on giving him access to his father's scrolls and property. He'd make it a surprise for the end of the second test. At the same time he could reveal the team's new teacher. Naruto was aiming for a Kiba repeat, when he could hang out with the Inuzuka clan for a month or so, training under Kunai for a reset or so, until he could face the thought of doing some wedding resets again. However, to his surprise, although he followed the Get Kiba as my opponent pattern to the letter, not telling Tenten any news of the upcoming test so Sasuke would not seek out Gaara, leaving them with the Orochimaru fight and the subsequent stuff leading up to him facing Kiba. Naruto found himself in the ring facing Sasuke for the prelims. Sending a shocked face over to the Hokage, Naruto saw Kakashi standing there by the scoreboard, and understood. Arash's child had finally begun to understand more of his original teacher, as he'd had to spend enough time around the lazy ninja to do it. Anko had been right. The man was living in his past, but while that was correct, it wasn't quite all of it. No one could deny that Kakashi was hung up on the death of his former teammate Obito. What Naruto thought was that, to Kakashi, Sasuke was a combination of Kakashi when he was young, and Obito. The lazy nin was doing his best to seek redemption for his own past by building up Sasuke, and didn't much care what it cost anyone else for him to do it. He wasn't thinking about those others, he was fixated on Sasuke. For some reason, the man kept trying to redeem his own past mistakes, and the debt he felt he owed to Obito, by paying those off to Sasuke, making him his avatar, hoping he would fulfill the way things ought to have gone, trying to make it all right so he could forgive himself of his own mistakes. Not that the last Uchiha appreciated those subtleties. In a way, it was amazing how much those two were alike. It reminded Naruto of something he'd once heard, long ago in those far-gone pre-reset days, that a person all wrapped up in themselves makes a very small package. Kakashi was fixated on his past, particularly Obito, while Sasuke was the same, also fixated on his past, although in his case it was his brother and his clan that filled every waking thought. And both, in their own ways, were miserable and by their self-focus helping to make those around them unhappy. It wasn't as if either had made a choice to be hurting those around them, nor did either think they were all that bad. They were both inconsiderate because in their minds there was no room to consider anything outside of their narrow focus. If you had no place in their plans, then you had no value to them. But now that Kakashi had a grudge against Naruto for denying him a chance to pander to the stuck-up Uchiha prodigy anymore, the Chunin had evidently decided to use Sasuke as his avatar to avenge this slight as well as his past. Begin. The head examiner slashed his arm down, commencing the fight. Naruto threw down a trio of smoke grenades, hoping to cloud the area to use his jutsu without the Uchiha stealing them. However, it turned out to be better for Sasuke than for him, as none of the examiners caught the Uchiha activating the cursed seal along with the Sharingan, and Sasuke was upon him before Naruto had even got the first-hand seal of his next move completed. After that, it was pretty much over. Sasuke copied over a dozen of Naruto's ninja techniques. And because of the Sharingan's ability to predict, Naruto couldn't get away, couldn't land a hit, and couldn't complete a ninja technique unless Sasuke let him because the Uchiha wanted to copy it. Sasuke had already closed the range to fist fighting, and he'd learned enough from stealing Lee's style to make that painful. Nor, with the cursed seal affecting his mind, was Sasuke at all restrained. Naruto spent the rest of that day in the hospital, after having a kunai pulled out from his head. He never even got to meet his new teacher or see the scrolls his father had left him. Then the reset happened. Naruto had a plan. It was an evil, awful and thoroughly wicked plan. It was never something he would have condoned under any circumstances whatsoever, except this one, where the patient wouldn't even remember the harm he'd done, because it would all be undone with the next reset. So, beat him, jail him, rob him blind, the village could all get as upset as they wanted over it. This sort of thing would guarantee his failure at the Chunin exam, so it'd all be over in the morning anyway. The plan was not very complicated. It was, however, extremely risky. First it involved finding Kakashi. This was not hard, as the guy spent half of every day staring at a monument. In the infinite time loops since, he'd even discovered what his teacher was doing there, recalling his teammate whose death had changed him, and whose dying wish had been to give Kakashi one of his Sharinganais, Obito Uchiha. He'd also discovered that bugging Kakashi for training while he was staring at the memorial stone was a sure path to pain and injury. Bugging Kakashi for training was nothing new to Naruto, he'd done it ever since the Jonin had become his official instructor. He'd chosen to do the bugging because, no matter that the man had a job to teach him, he'd never actually taught them anything, except the once with the tree climbing thing, and even then he'd just shown them that it could be done, then told them to do it and walked away without any explanation whatsoever. So, in a way, as his Jonin instructor, Kakashi even owed it to him. It required something like 3 resets to get right. So, bright and early in the morning before the written test, Naruto headed over there and gave a hearty cry to Kakashi, calling out that he wanted training. The blow he got would knock him out for hours. Fortunately, Naruto had already seeded the area with clones, who watched and took notes, from several angles, on the precise nature and direction of the fully expected blow. Why? Because it would be delivered exactly that way again after the reset, provided the other variables were kept consistent. So, bright and early the next morning, at exactly the same time as before and following the same path, he'd called out the same words to Kakashi, to prove that he could keep all of the details consistent. Sure enough, the blow came exactly the same way. That set things up for the third day, where everything proceeded exactly according to the pattern set out before, only with 2 important differences from the last time. The first was that it was a clone that approached and called out to Kakashi. This was because the real Naruto planned to be busy all that day and couldn't afford to be knocked out for hours. But it was impossible even for advanced bloodlines to tell the difference between the real him and a shadow clone before the first hit had landed, so that was all right. No, it was the second change that was important. A seal painted precisely over the point of impact that released several hundred cc's of high-potency knockout drugs obtained at the hospital into the Jonin's system the moment he touched it. If his Sharingan had been uncovered he would have noticed it, even written in orange ink that precisely matched the clone's clothing, as it was. But his eye wasn't open. As always, he'd kept his special eye covered up behind his headband until he'd thought he'd really had a use for it, and beating up an unskilled genin didn't count. Caught entirely by surprise, the Jonin dropped like a rock. Before the cloud of smoke from the first clone's dispersal was finished, one of Naruto's other clones had performed the body switch technique with the fallen Jonin, and used transformation to become his virtual twin. That got the real Jonin transferred to the clone's former location, safely undercover and out of sight, while the clone replacement took Kakashi's place staring at the monument and trying to disguise how bored he was. If this was starting to sound as highly planned and orchestrated as a bank robbery, that's probably because it was, and that for very good reason. He was going to rob Kakashi. In fact, Naruto was going to take away his most precious possession, and that wasn't his Icha. No, the genin made doubly sure his teacher was both bound and sedated, then activated his chakra scalpels and went to work extracting his Sharingan. One of his clones would then do the reverse, and insert the eye into Naruto, a fairly basic part of the advanced medical training he was getting. Transplants were needed with some frequency amongst ninja, and they got to those classes early. Naruto did this because he needed it, and his teacher would get it back after the next reset anyway. He'd literally never know he'd been missing it. The boy would never do this ordinarily, but he was beginning to feel desperate. because Naruto had a theory. He had no idea if it was correct or not, that's why it was a theory and not a proven fact. Its basis was simply this: time after time he'd witnessed Sasuke gain Lee's fighting style simply by watching him use it. That had been enough to get him curious, but on careful questioning of him later, Naruto learned that the Uchiha didn't have a proper mental grasp of all of the whys and wherefores that went into the forms, he just did them. Like a reflex. That thought was enough to get Naruto practically possessed for a chance to try out his idea. It could remove the one major blockage he'd encountered and set his feet once again on the path to becoming a kid-level ninja. But he'd never acted on that because, until now, he'd never had the medical skill or chakra control to pull it off successfully. It wasn't like he could just drag his unconscious teacher into Konoha's hospital and demand a transplant of Kakashi's eye. The village pariah had been able to master his desire to do this until he'd largely been able to forget about it up until Sasuke had used his Sharingan against him in their last fight. That pretty much pulled off the gloves. Sasuke wasn't on his nice guy list anymore. Naruto had paid in sweat, blood and tears for those techniques, only to have the Uchiha taking them from him as if anything he wanted was his by right, just because he was an Uchiha. So there was a bit of petty revenge in doing this, but there was also a higher purpose. The Sharingan copied things. Everybody knew that. Training under Ibisu had made it painfully clear to Naruto that there was a world of difference between merely knowing a technique and having fully mastered it. He'd also observed this himself directly getting beaten up by Sasuke, and when he'd seen Kakashi use copied techniques, they were far from fully mastered. Kakashi and Sasuke didn't have to think about what they were doing when they used a copied form or technique. Nor did any of the knowledge behind them copy over. They were simply automatic. That meant they were reflexive. The fact that they didn't have full mastery at once suggested that copied skills were only reflexes, like the Sharingan had copied those skills directly into their muscle memories. They hadn't truly learned them until they'd also mastered the mental parts. But the time-looping boy needed reflexes in order to complete or progress in many of his skills. He'd already mastered the mental parts, at least as far as he could get until he could also get the physical stuff mastered. So, he'd needed the Sharingan, even if only to try out his little theory. Deciding to do it after Sasuke and Kakashi had both turned against him in that test was easy. He knew of only two sources of the Sharingan, and of those two, both were vulnerable to a properly set up ambush, so both were available, but Kakashi owed him instruction and Sasuke didn't. Besides, to avoid anyone noticing what had happened until Naruto was finished, the boy was planning on having one of his clones impersonate the victim until that reset was over. And of the two, it was easier to stare at a rock and be lazy than it was to fight Orochimaru and deal with fangirls. The procedure to extract one of his own eyes and implant the Sharingan was not exactly pleasant, even under sedation. Still, his healing factor kicked in right away and dealt with the headache soon enough. After that, Naruto was looking out on the world through a copycat eye. It was weird, everything was strange when viewed through the Sharingan. Immediately retiring to a safe place, the Forest of Death was surprisingly good for this, as no one went there casually, and the official staff wasn't due to go there till tomorrow. The blonde Gen informed hundreds of clones and sat very carefully observing them while they went through his whole range of ninja techniques and martial arts moves, splayed out in such a way so that he could observe them from every angle. It went surprisingly quickly. Body switch, clone, transformation and body flicker took mere seconds. Shadow clone technique he hadn't learned anything extra on since beginning the resets. Sexy and harem techniques were based on others he had already copied remastered versions for, but he copied them again anyway. After that, it was a good solid hour of watching his clones perform the forms of the martial arts he knew of, all careful to do them exactly so he wouldn't be memorizing any errors, before launching into sparring. Then they played with instruments lifted from the not yet open music shop, performed all of the stitches and hammering they knew of, and it was over, they were done. Even after repeating everything just to be sure, the whole thing had taken almost none of the time he'd imagined it would, and he could feel it taking hold. It was a most odd sensation, hard to describe, like goo sliding down the inside of your limbs, coating your muscles from within, as the Sharingan copied those moves. Dispersing those clones, he formed others with the new set possessing the same change he himself had just undergone. And when they fell to sparring, both their minds and their bodies knew the style, making them all at least double the speed he'd been when it had merely been his mind forcing his body through the techniques. So the experiment had been a success. And the reflexes may be recorded by the muscles, they are recorded on the nerves. So if the nerves of his mind could recall stuff despite a reset, then the ones in his arms and legs ought to as well. And so it proved. It was an amazing victory. He could never be as strong or as fast as the Uchiha was with the cursed seal on. Heck, he wasn't even the equal to many of the dedicated martial arts specialists his age. The kyubis decorating may have given him a boost in those areas, but it had been added on top of close to nothing. Still, having imprinted the wanted reflexes via the Sharingan had unblocked him. He could progress in music and martial arts and other physical skills again. He was even a few fractions of a second faster on his basic 3 ninja techniques, which, considering how fast he'd been before, squeezing even the slightest improvement out on those was quite remarkable. But he'd done it, and what's more, he'd improved his ability to use those while in pain or otherwise distracted, because the body could afford to do them almost on autopilot while his mind was busy dealing with those distractions. That was about as solid as anyone could ever get those basic ninja skills to be. More would be asking for the moon. However, it was the sudden progress of his long stagnated fighting skills that were the real source of joy to the boy. Everything he did could benefit by having better martial arts skills. It was one of those things he'd been drawn to early on, and that had consistently paid off whenever he'd been able to get any better at it. Now, according to those fighting instructors he'd sought out so long ago, he ought to be twice as good as he'd been before, even while having the same level of knowledge. Just having his body know those moves as well as his mind did ought to double his prowess, according to them. And, having double the top rookie genin fighting ability he'd been stuck at, ought to be enough to qualify him for about as good as a rookie Chunin ought to be, taking away a major handicap from him. Now he could work on thinking tactically, because the complex motions of the actual forms, the stances, punches, blocks and so on, were automatic. His body could react faster, and could carry through on those motions without needed any input from his mind guiding them along, freeing that resource up to be plotting ahead to the next moves. No wonder the Uchiha felt so invincible. Suddenly saddened by that thought, Naruto considered something. He'd run through all he'd intended to do with this eye already. There was nothing else on his list, except maybe to watch his clones spar some more, but that didn't really feel productive. Deciding to continue on with his Foxy Bits experiments, and discovering that it was still early enough to get to the testing center if he hurried, the boy threw on a disguise technique to look like a normal Naruto and ran off. By tagging different people with his tail, he was learning to track multiple targets simultaneously, and across wider distances. That was an experiment worth continuing, and the best, widest distributed, most interesting group to track was his fellow Chunin hopefuls. The loser of Team 7 had once gotten Ibisu to admit to what ranking he had for chakra capacity, as opposed to his ever-pathetic chakra control that all of his teachers kept riding him for. Ibisu had fought tooth and nail against telling him, fought it like he was going to die if he gave up the secret. In the end the answer came only through him tricking the teaching specialist into revealing how chakra capacity could be measured, one tidbit at a time, until he'd assembled the whole process and could measure himself. He was Kij level, easily. More to the point, he'd been Kij level on chakra capacity even before he'd begun the time loop he was now caught in. The amount of shadow clones he used alone was proof of that. What's more, this was known to every Jonin, and most of the Chunin, in Konoha. Why they'd rather give up a lung than tell him, though, the blonde didn't know. Maybe it was one of those laws the Hokage had passed to protect him. But maybe it was something else, or something that Kakashi had done. He didn't know. What he did know was that it was a real pain to have so little critical information concerning himself. Maybe that whole know thyself and thy enemy thing had another edge to it after all. It wasn't like the outcome of any of his fights with Orochimaru was in doubt, the Sannin would always kill him and the boy would always die. It was possible, Naruto felt, that he didn't know himself as well as he'd thought. It seemed there was always stuff about him turning up he didn't know, and he didn't know, but that turned out to be important. And why keep it from him, anyway? No one had any problem telling Sakura she had perfect chakra control. And if anyone even thought that the Uchiha had a Kij-level chakra capacity, they'd never be able to shut up about it. It would be shouted from the rooftops and they'd probably have parades to celebrate the discovery. But no, every teacher he'd had so far had told him how his chakra control kept him from learning this or that, but no one ever taught him the sort of things that massive chakra capacity was good for. Want someone to body flicker from one end of Konoha to the other without stopping in between? Fine. He could do that. He wouldn't even feel the drain. Need the Hokage monument moved west 11 feet. Teach him a technique and he'd give it a try. But no, they didn't. Rather than lean to his strength, they endlessly used his weakness as an excuse not to teach him, mostly probably because Kakashi had told them to. They hadn't even told him he had a strength. They let people like Sakura call him useless, and stood by doing nothing, as if they agreed. There had to be other people in Konoha with average chakra control, right? That's why they call it average, don't they? Because that's what most people have. So they had to have something for those ninja to do, right? Why couldn't he do that? He'd probably be good at it. Instead he'd had to bounce around a dozen tasks he wasn't all that good at naturally, just to have something to use his time on. Heck. The pink-haired fangirl had perfect control because she had practically no chakra to begin with. It's easy to be exact with an eyedropper. On the other hand, Naruto'd been a streaming fire whose resting to get the thing on target at all was a major achievement. That he'd achieved something close to accuracy with it should have been celebrated as a marvelous accomplishment. And then he'd managed to get the same level of control out of a freaking geyser. He knew by now he had better control than Sasuke did or ever had. And he'd always had dozens of times the chakra capacity of the other guy. Yet they celebrated the Uchiha and despised him. Oh, he knew why. The one was the precious Uchiha, the other was the demon container, the village pariah, the hated Uzumaki. Still, he'd hoped some of the Jonin, at least, could look past that. But he guessed not. Not with Kakashi telling them not to, lest it interrupt his training with him. As if he'd ever taught anything. All of this was getting rather far afield, however. Naruto had begun this time loop thing with Kage-level chakra reservoirs, but chakra was composed of mind and body energies. His mind energies stank, or had stunk. Practically all of that amazing chakra capacity had been body energy alone. And well, after he'd begun teaching himself things and overcoming mental blocks, that wasn't the case anymore. His mind energies were growing. They weren't Kage level yet, but they were getting there, and he didn't hesitate to call his purely academic ninja abilities roughly Chunin level. With his physical limits the way they'd been, there wasn't a great deal he could do other than to teach himself things and learn to use his mind. And what this did to his chakra reserves was predictable. They'd been shooting up, and up, and up the entire time he'd been trapped in this loop developing his mind. He didn't have a rank for them anymore, they blew off the tops of the charts, somewhere way above Kage level and rising with no limits in sight. And then, of course, the Kyuubi had gone and added to them. Naruto didn't even feel the drain of having an open and active Sharingan as he went to rush off to the testing center. In fact, he'd forgotten all about it, so used to and conditioned by the resets to moving on past something once he'd completed his plans concerning it that it never even entered his head what to do with it after he was done. Naruto barely got to the building on time for his usual arrival, which meant that he'd had no time to do all of those useful pre-arrival things like get to Hinata-chan and make her blush, visit the Hokage to wheedle out the Uchiha estate, and so on. But still, on time was on time, and he didn't have to get those things. Luckily Sakura was too busy cooing over Sasuke to glare at him, as he wasn't all that late. So they went into the building together, breezed by those two Chunin with the disguised door, and Naruto, already having the disguise and veil techniques they were using, didn't even notice the slight putting down my limbs sensation caused by seeing them, and were on their way to the room they were after when Lee appeared to give his challenge to Sasuke. That's right. No Hinata this morning, so that meant Lee would proceed with his challenge against Sasuke, trying to prove that hard work was superior to being a genius. Sasuke got most of his later accomplishments in martial arts out of this fight. His skills were solidly genin before this, and didn't impress Orochimaru no matter how ticked off Naruto got him. The jerk had stolen Lee's pride and joy, his fighting style, then renamed it and used it as if it was his own. Naruto had also copied a few moves out of this fight, which was impressive, as he'd never had the Sharingan. The Soul Blonde present stood frozen as Lee finished off his fight sequence, and when he recovered from his shocked and frozen state he started to inwardly berate himself. Darn it! Now he was getting as bad as Sasuke. It was one thing to copy Lee's moves when he was just using hard work. The chakra-disabled ninja respected nothing like he respected that. Hard work was what he lived for. But to steal those hard-won abilities using a bloodline, that was just cheating. And Naruto had forgotten until that fight was over that he'd had a Sharingan up and active. Inside himself, the blonde resolved to make this up to Lee somehow, and as some of his most recent advances were in the field of medicine, he chose to try the impossible. He would reconstruct Lee's chakra coils so the brave, if odd, green-clad genin could mold chakra as well as anyone else. One of his medical instructors had actually used Lee's case as an example of procedures too dangerous to pursue, granting him only a 1 in 10,000 chance of being cured, even using dangerous, experimental techniques. Naruto drew in a deep breath and firmed up his resolve, promising himself that he could do it anyway. After all, if it took him 10,000 resets to get that 10,000 to 1 chance, in the end he'd still learn how to do it. The clone shapeshifted into Kakashi's form, met them all at the door, gave them Kakashi's lines in a very Kakashi manner, then disappeared off to go follow Kunai to what he assumed was the Jonin lounge. Smirking, Naruto sent a few fox-shaped clones throughout the class as the Chunin hopefuls were milling about before Ibuki called them all to order. Then, once everyone was in their seats and he and Hinata were noisily making out at the front of the class, tests already completed, the explosive tags those clones had set on certain chairs went off, catapulting Kabuto and others out of their blast zones, overturning desks and raining debris over a wide area. The silver-haired traitor had gotten embedded in the ceiling, neck broken, but living. Many of the other hopefuls were also in critical condition. But they were all very bad people. Laughing inside, Naruto went off to the hospital as a concerned friend with Kabuto too out of it to say otherwise. The unconscious traitor was not able to use his regeneration technique, so by staying by the side of him, as well as Kabuto's team and other casualties, Naruto was able to observe close at hand while the Konoha medics used a wide assortment of emergency medical jutsu to stabilize the wounded. Then, by impersonating a nurse, he was able to observe them throughout surgery, and then beyond, picking up a complete inventory of techniques of which he'd known the theory for simply years, but hadn't yet mastered as far as the practical side of things. Flitting in and about as they treated the host of wounded, plus the ordinary flow of that hospital they'd normally see, Naruto's education into the medical arts expanded by leaps and bounds. Assuming the identity of a female doctor to walk out of the place, Naruto even got drafted to help on the still critical rush of wounded, and found him /herself using those techniques on the female genin from Sound, who'd had a substantial portion of her ribcage crushed and pelvis shattered, with some possible damage to the spine. Figuring the worst he/she could do would be kill her, and that the Sound genin was an enemy anyway, and thus, it would be no shame if she died, Naruto set about using those techniques she had recently caught. It turned out to be an enlightening experience. The Sound genin even lived through his /her efforts. From the successful effort, the disguised young boy then got drafted in to help on other cases, getting more surgical assignments and assisting with even better doctors, until he'd spent the whole afternoon undercover at the hospital learning what they did there to treat injuries. It was not all chakra control, or even book knowledge. Knowing what he did about anatomy helped more than he would have supposed, but his experience so far had always been with girls whose skins had been intact, and they looked really different on the inside. They were filled with ikigu, for the most part. Not very pretty at all. Still, having his cherry popped as an emergency medic, so to speak, the boy dragged himself home to sleep long and hard, only to be woken in the morning by Sakura, who'd been worried over not seeing him after the test the other day, and so come to check on him to make sure he got to the second test on time. That was a first. Wait a minute, Naruto sat up, rubbing at his eyes. You mean I actually passed? What with all that was going on, the head examiner didn't give the 10th question, Sakura blurted, shoving his clothes at them, then locking him in his bathroom. You scored 9 out of 9, although how you did it is beyond me. I was certain those questions were above you. I cheated off of Hinata, he answered absently, getting dressed as quickly as possible. He'd have to use a camping jutsu to bathe later on, when he had more time. He still could hardly believe he'd passed. That had not been his intention. He'd just filled in those answers as usual to avoid stressing out Hinata, then gone off with those medics to pirate some healing skills. Apparently things got resolved favorably in his absence. He'd not been expecting it. Pausing, the boy's eyes lit up. If they were going to the forest, that meant they'd soon be fighting against Orochimaru. Oh yeah. He could use this new advantage to see through some of the Snake Freak's ninja techniques, and Naruto had absolutely no problem stealing from an enemy. That meant there were 1 or 2 other fights in that forest he really ought to get an eye on. And, knowing the various times during which those happened, having observed them all at least once before, he could do it if he gave a prodigious waste of chakra on body flickers. He. Sprinkling rain of senbon needles, here we come. By the time the preliminary tests arrived, Naruto was feeling bloated. He'd stolen techniques from half of the Chunin hopefuls, some of those by accident as they'd been used by Konoha ninja fighting outright enemies of Konoha, and somehow he was planning to make those up to them, somehow. The boy wrote himself a blanket check, saying within himself that saving the village from the upcoming invasion would cover those thefts from Konoha, although how he was going to repay Kankuro for stealing that illusion he used to disguise his puppet as himself, was a puzzle. Actually, there was more to it than that, as he'd quite by accident stolen most of the puppet user's basic arsenal while they'd been fighting other teams. More than he'd gotten out of the boy during conversation, anyway. How he was going to make that up to the older boy he didn't know, so he chalked it up as a debt to be paid and resolved to think more on it later. Now he had to get himself a fan like Tamrai had. Those moves of hers were cool. And, speaking as her husband, even if that wasn't true in this reset, he felt he had a right to her techniques, so long as he shared his in return. That was fair, wasn't it? Then the prelim fights started, and Naruto gazed intently on that guy who drained chakra, knowing as he did so how useful that technique would be to defeat Neji, if he ever had to fight the Hyuga genius again, which was likely. It wasn't unavoidable. Drawing numbered stones out that bag to determine who fought who in the first rounds of the finals gave him just enough control to influence that to be fighting someone else. And then the invasion would happen to curtail any further matches. But still, having the ability to do so at need gave him a better chance to avenge Hinata without getting beaten up himself. He didn't learn much from watching the chakra-draining genin. What the guy did was mostly safe from the Sharingan, but that was okay. He'd learned enough that with a lot of hard work, maybe he could reconstruct that technique himself from scratch. Then Naruto peered, watching very closely as Hinata fought her cousin Neji, cheering on his pale-haired beloved until she fought with the best she had. She'd lose, she always did in these prelims fighting against her cousin, but with what he'd learned by watching her, Naruto could now be far more confident of his ability to impersonate her should she need a stand-in in future matches, like he'd done with her at their wedding. And he also got to analyze Neji's style, and perhaps he could learn later how to train her to fight against it. Naruto couldn't use the gentle fist style, as it required their bloodline, but a wicked gleam came to the blonde boy's eyes. He'd never be as strong or as fast as the real close combat fighters who had trained for this all of their lives, the resets made that impossible. But the push chakra out through your fingers part of the gentle fist style just sounded like a good chakra control exercise that ought to benefit him whether or not he could make anything else of it. And, bloodlines could be stolen, couldn't they? I mean, there he was watching this fight through a Sharingan eye. He was going to be doing the research on bloodline theft just because Tenten had asked him to, that reset where they'd gotten married. And, so long as he was going to be a donor, granting his gifts to his wives, then maybe Hinata, once she had his regeneration, wouldn't mind letting him and her sister wives have her bloodline too. That could be dead useful. No need to trick people into being anatomy models for one, or playing around with corpses or whatever those medics did to get their first-hand knowledge of internal anatomy. They can't all have started that side of their studies with their hands already on a desperately wounded patient, could they? No, they couldn't. It wasn't possible. Naruto had tried learning his operating on clones, but that was useless, as they vanished the moment their bodies got disrupted. However, the boys' planning got cut short, as the head examiner called out the next match. Between all those he'd wounded with tags previous to this, and the consequent mix-up of losses in the forest, there had been an unequal number of strong versus weak Chunin hopefuls arrived to the preliminaries, and the Hokage thought he was being kind to Naruto, giving him his own weak opponent so he'd have a chance to advance to the finals. Too bad that weak opponent chosen for him was Lee. After having been beaten about by a wrecking ball moving at pinball speeds, Naruto decided that it was probably for the best, as the Sharingan was just way too addictive, and considering what he knew of those who had it, if he'd kept it for much longer it would obviously make him stupid, or at least lazy. Meanwhile, the Kakashi clone had been having a somewhat interesting week. All he'd had to do was disguise a science text in an orange cover and no one looked at him at all funny when he was reading in public. Okay, they looked at him funny, but it was a "how dare you, you pervert" sort of funny, instead of a "why is he doing that" sort of funny. People knew why Kakashi did that. It was because he was pervy. So at least the week hadn't been a total loss, as he'd gotten some good reading done. Naruto had had to replace the clone impersonating Kakashi at least once a day, more if it had used any techniques, but considering how lazy that Chunin was, it had been easy enough not to most of the time, and he'd gotten to learn tons of things while doing it. For example, the clones tending the real Kakashi in the cave in which they'd kept him had gotten to see the guy's face under that mask he perennially wore. Not that it was all that interesting, you had the outline just glancing at the guy through the thin material. But still, it was an interesting goal to have achieved, just to say you'd done it. He'd also learned more about where the Jonin lived, and while Naruto had a place he'd made nice inside of a dump, his teacher was the opposite, living in a nice place that he'd made into a dump through laziness and not caring. Still, he'd gotten to see the broken bits of the famous sword of Kakashi's father, and that the Jonin had broken carelessly. Actually, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Jonin lived a depressing life, and what made it worse to consider was the guy had basically chosen for it to be that way. When Team 7 had arrived out of the forest, Kakashi had gotten called upon to put a restraining seal on over the one Orochimaru had placed on Sasuke. Picking the most likely seeming one he knew of from the Anbu files, Kakashi had taken Sasuke aside to the room he knew the original always used, and began to emplace the seal, tapping into a hidden bag of pig's blood to use to write them, rather than cutting his own finger, because, as a clone, he knew that cutting his own finger would dispel him. He was basically done with the design, fascinated to watch the several yards across diagram pick itself up to compress into a much smaller space, and the possible extraneous uses for that, when Orochimaru appeared, gloating. And those boasts he made were very enlightening. So, how do you get two Piccolo players to play in tune? Naruto /Sasuke asked at his free, complimentary music lesson. You shoot one of the Piccolo players, the music teacher told him with a smile. Now let us go back to fingering those keys. You know, honestly, it never struck me before. The music teacher looked at the all-Piccolo band of some 30 or so Narutos, who were, incidentally, all playing in tune with one another. That all you'd really need is 30 or so of the same Piccolo player. Naruto skipped down the street, laughing loudly. He really loved having Kunai as a teacher, he really did. Unfortunately, she was too fair a teacher for his purposes, as, after having spent 1 month long repeat with her learning all he could. When the next time to be her student came around, she carefully tested his knowledge, then told him frankly it would only take her a little over a month to bring her team up to speed with him, and that after that she'd prefer to teach them all together. Naruto was crushed. But she wasn't going to play favorites, and her team ought to know this information, too. In a bunch of ways he could admire and respect her for it, and only wish his own instructor had been half that even-handed. But for his purposes it was awfully inconvenient, to say the least. Still, inconvenient was among the least of his woes. Naruto found he was fighting hard against the lure of the Sharingan. He'd never have believed it, but that thing was like a drug. Once you'd had it, there was this intense desire for more of it. He'd caught himself planning for more repeats like that last one, where he'd gone around behind a Sharingan learning more than he'd ever done before, and at the same time horrified by how much he wanted this, because he knew that having mastered those techniques you already had made you a better and more effective ninja. But at the same time he felt this huge desire to forget about mastering any of this most recent haul and just go out rampantly stealing any and all techniques he could get anyone to demonstrate for, or even against, him, thinking about people he could attack and force to use moves on him. And that desire scared him. It came out of nowhere, and it was as much as he could do sometimes to stop himself from going up to Kakashi to bonk him on the head to pluck out and use that eye again. He'd even felt such an urge in public, before witnesses. He'd burgled enough houses during his cat burglar days to know that some things you got away with when no one was looking were just plain out when they were. He knew better than that. But this urge to pluck out and stick in another Sharingan was overpowering, and for that he gradually grew terrified of it, concerned because if he did this again, he might not be able to stop doing it always. And being a prisoner to his own urges was just wrong. He, who already had a prisoner in his body, thank you very much, didn't want to be another. He didn't want to join the Kyuubi in being enslaved to a body he was no longer master of. And so, much as it had helped him, the boy resolved to avoid the Sharingan in the future. It just got too dangerous. Those desires to make him keep it were very nearly overwhelming to the boy, and he didn't dare to risk any further temptation. He'd have to quit cold turkey, at least until he'd found a way to beat these desires for good. And, while that was a disappointment in some ways, it was less so than it might have been. He'd already caught up on body skills to where his mind had gotten. He could hammer or spar far more easily than before, as his body just took over on autopilot, needing only occasional direction from his brain. The same went for his techniques, and many of his basic ones were now up to where they'd be considered perfect, no improvement possible. And speaking of the Kyuubi, the old vixen had healed up considerably the last time he'd checked on her. Oh, sure, she was still pretty beat up, but nothing like she had been. The rents in her coat had mostly closed now, and her rate of healing had accelerated, as if she had crossed some threshold from barely hanging on to getting better now. So it looked like he'd have someone to talk to soon, at any rate. Of course, for the immediate present, he had techniques to perfect, loads of them. He'd never even have guessed how many spying techniques were being used during that written test. Anko's entrance had contained a very highly skilled acrobatic maneuver that took more talent than he would have initially believed. Then there was the not-to-be-overlooked way that Lee fought, or what he'd picked up from Guy that time he'd stopped his prize pupil from pulverizing Sasuke. He owed it to those two to pick up as much of the mental aspect of their art as they would let him. It was only fair to figure out why you moved this way instead of that, and all of those niggling little details. It was their art, after all, and they were far from his enemies, so that meant he had to respect how they wanted their art to be seen and used. He wasn't about to run about wearing green spandex, but putting in some hard work as a tribute to their own was the least of what he could do. Then, of course, there were all of those lovely little ninja techniques that he'd picked up from observing those foreign shinobi fight during the forest part of the exam. And, not to be overlooked, all of those combat teachers he'd originally impersonated Sasuke to approach, were now approachable. He could get new people to teach him again. Oh yes. He had good cause to cackle as he bounded merrily along,